Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A just and humane society where all government policies are directed at lifting our citizens out of poverty and creating a just and equitable dispensation. To achieve this goal, we need to have peace and stability. Thus, our foreign policy aims to have peace with our neighbors and settle disputes through dialogue. Mr. President, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations is an extremely important milestone, as this is the only body in the world that can help us achieve our goals of peace and stability in our neighborhood. This is also time for us to reflect whether, as the United Nations, we have been able to realize the promise we collectively made to our peoples. Today, the foundations of the world order, non-use of or threat of unilateral force, self-determination of peoples, the sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, international cooperation. All these ideals are being systematically eroded. International agreements are being flouted and set aside. Renewed great power rivalries are leading to a new arms race. Conflicts are proliferating and intensifying. Military occupation, illegal annexations are suppressing the rights of human beings to self-determination. According to the respected professor Noam Chomsky, mankind is at even a greater risk than it was before the First and Second World Wars in the last century. And this is because of the threat, increased threat of nuclear war, climate change, and sadly the rise of authoritarian regimes. COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated the oneness of humanity. In our interconnected world, no one is safe unless everyone is safe. Locking down to control the pandemic has triggered the worst recession since the Great. This has hit the poorest countries the hardest, as well as the poor in all the countries. In Pakistan, we realized very early on that if we imposed a strict lockdown, the type that several affluent countries had imposed, we would have more people dying of hunger than the virus. Therefore, we adopted a policy of smart lockdown. While concentrating on the hotspots, the virus hotspots, we opened up our agriculture sector immediately, and then followed it up by the construction sector, which employed most of the people. At the same time, and this is despite financial constraints, my government deployed $8 billion, unprecedented amount for our health services, plus support the poorest and most payments through SARS program, and then subsidies to the small businesses. Even though our smart lockdown was heavily criticized in the beginning, but thanks all Kashmiri political leaders were incarcerated. About 13,000 Kashmiri youth were abducted and thousands tortured. A complete curfew was imposed, accompanied by a total communications blackout. Indian occupation forces have used pellet guns against peaceful protesters, imposed collective punishments, including the destruction of entire neighborhoods, and extrajudicially murdered hundreds of innocent young Kashmiris in fake encounters, refusing even to hand over their bodies for burial. The Kashmiri media and those daring to raise their voice are being systematically harassed and intimidated through the use of draconian laws. All of this is well documented in the reports of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, communications from the Special Rapporteurs of Human Rights Council, statements from human rights and civil society organizations. The international community must investigate these grave violations and prosecute the Indian civil and military personnel involved in state terrorism and serious crimes against humanity being perpetrated, I'm sad to say, with complete impunity. The objective of this brutal campaign is to impose what the RSS-BJP regime has itself called the final solution for Jammu and Kashmir. To this end, the military siege is being followed by moves to change the demographic structure of the occupied territory. This is an attempt to obliterate the distinct Kashmiri identity in order to effect the outcome of a plebiscite envisaged in the UN Security Council resolutions. This action is in violation of the UN Charter, Council resolutions, and international law, particularly the Fourth Geneva Convention. Changing demographic structure of occupied territory is a war crime. Mr. President, the brave Kashmiri people will never submit to Indian occupation and oppression. Their struggle is indigenous. They are fighting for a just cause, and generation after generation have laid down their lives to rid themselves of Indian occupation. The government and people of Pakistan are committed to standing by and supporting the Kashmiri brothers and sisters in the legitimate struggle for self-determination. Mr. President, in order to divert attention from its illegal actions and atrocities in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, India is playing a dangerous game of upping the military ante against Pakistan in a nuclearized environment. Despite constant Indian provocations and ceasefire violations along the line of control and the working boundary, targeting innocent civilians, Pakistan has exercised maximum
final
restraint.
Solution for Jammu and Kashmir.
We have consistently sensitized the world community about a false flag operation and another ill-conceived misadventure by India. My parents, Mr. President, were born in the colonial India, and I was the first generation that grew up in an independent Pakistan. I want to make it clear that any attempt by the fascist, totalitarian, RSS-led Indian government to aggress against Pakistan will be met by a nation that will fight for its freedom to the end. Mr. President, there will be no durable peace and stability in South Asia until the Jammu and Kashmir dispute is resolved on the basis of international legitimacy. Kashmir has been rightly described as a nuclear flashpoint. The Security Council must prevent a disaster conflict and secure the implementation of its own resolutions, as it did in the case of East Timor. The Council has considered the situation in Jammu and Kashmir 3 times in the past year. It must take appropriate enforcement actions. It must also take steps to protect the Kashmiris from an impending genocide by India. Pakistan has always called for a peaceful solution
To this end, India must ascend. To reach this end, India must ascend the measures it has instituted since 5th August 2019, end its military siege and other gross human rights violations